She was pouring a $1,200 bottle of Bordeaux when she heard the lie that was about to cost a dangerous man everything he owned. Imani Cross didn't let her hand shake, didn't miss the mark by a millimeter, and didn't let a single drop stain the white tablecloth. That was the trick to surviving as a waitress at the Gilded Lily, Atlanta's most cutthroat steakhouse where the lighting was dim and the secrets were bright. You learned early on how to keep your face like stone while your brain was translating a disaster in real time. She finished the pour at table 2, offered a practiced, empty smile and retreated into the shadows. Then she adjusted her apron, gripped her serving tray, and moved back toward the corner booth to listen to the man with the neck tattoos. Now, before we get into the heat of this, if you've ever sat back and watched a professional look someone in the eye and lie through their teeth while you were the only one who knew the truth, this story is for you. Stay tuned, because what Imani did next didn't just break restaurant protocol. It blew up a $40 million deal and put a target on her back she never saw coming. Do me a favor, drop a comment right now and tell me, if you were holding that wine bottle and heard a scam unfolding, would you speak up or keep your mouth shut to keep your job? Think about it, because by the end of this story, you're going to see exactly what happens when an invisible waitress decides she's finally heard enough. The Gilded Lily was the kind of place where the air felt thick with the scent of aged leather, expensive cigars, and the quiet, vibrating hum of power. To the patrons, Imani was just a pair of hands, graceful, silent, and entirely replaceable. She moved through the dining room with a ghost's precision, her movements dictated by a decade of discipline and a desperate need to remain unnoticed. Behind her professional mask, however, her mind was a constant, frantic calculator. Every time a guest ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than her monthly rent, she did the math. A bottle of 2015 Screaming Eagle. That was 3 rounds of her mother's physical therapy, a side of Wagyu beef. That covered the late fee on the hospital's predatory payment plan. Imani's life had become a series of subtractions. It hadn't always been this way. 2 years ago, she had been the youngest senior partner at a boutique linguistics firm, her name a gold standard for international legal translations. But a paperwork error, orchestrated by a partner she trusted, had stripped her of her certification and her savings in one fell swoop. Now, instead of translating billion-dollar mergers, she was memorizing the daily specials and ignoring the dull ache in her lower back. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a rhythmic, insistent vibration that she knew was the hospital's billing department. She didn't need to look at the screen to know what the message said. Final notice. Her mother, Dorothy, was a woman who had spent 40 years teaching poetry to disinterested teenagers, only to be rewarded with a degenerative spinal condition that the insurance company labeled pre-existing whenever it suited their bottom line. Imani paused near the service station, taking a steadying breath. She looked at her reflection in the polished brass of the espresso machine. Her eyes were tired, the light of the prodigy she used to be buried under layers of survival instinct. She was 28 years old, a master of 5 languages, and she was currently worried about whether a table of 4 would leave a 20% tip so she could buy the specialized vitamins her mother needed by Friday. The glass ceiling above her wasn't just metaphorical. It was the literal vaulted skylight of the restaurant, showing a sky she no longer felt she belonged to. She was stuck in the shadows, a witness to a world of wealth that remained stubbornly out of reach. But as she straightened her blouse and reached for a fresh linen napkin, she felt that familiar spark of indignation. She was tired of being the observer. She was tired of the silence. She just didn't know yet that the silence was about to be broken by a lie so loud, she wouldn't be able to ignore it. The memory of her downfall always tasted like the cheap, burnt coffee of a windowless deposition room. Long before she was Imani the waitress, she was Imani Cross, the silver tongue of the Southeast. At 26, she had been a phenomenon, a woman who could navigate a Mandarin contract as easily as a German engineering blueprint. She had built Cross and Sterling from a shared desk in a basement into a firm that the city's elite trusted with their most sensitive secrets. Julian Sterling had been the man who convinced her that her brilliance needed his business acumen. He was all smooth smiles and expensive silk ties, the kind of partner who handled the boring logistics so Imani could focus on the nuances of language. She had trusted him with the keys to the kingdom, never suspecting that while she was busy bridging worlds, Julian was busy selling hers off brick by brick. The betrayal hadn't come with a bang, but with a stack of forged documents. Julian had used her digital signature to authorize a series of certified translations for a shell company involved in offshore money laundering. By the time the federal investigators knocked on her door, the money was gone, and Julian had vanished into a cloud of plausible deniability, leaving Imani holding a paper trail that pointed directly at her heart. "I didn't sign these, Julian," she had whispered into a dead phone line for weeks. The ethics board hadn't cared about her excuses. To them, the silver tongue had been bought. They didn't see the woman who stayed up until 3:00 a.m. ensuring a single verb was translated with the correct legal weight. They saw a young, ambitious woman who had supposedly cut corners for a payday that never existed. They stripped her of her master's certification, blacklisted her from the only industry she had ever known, and left her with a legal bill that swallowed her savings in a single gulp. It was more than just a loss of a career. It was a fundamental shattering of her faith in the power of words. She had spent her life believing that if you translated the truth accurately enough, the world would make sense. Julian had proven that a well-placed lie, delivered with enough confidence, could rewrite reality entirely. Now, as she stood in the dim light of the Gilded Lily, the ghost of that betrayal felt like a phantom limb. She had spent the last 2 years training herself to hear everything and say nothing, to be a vessel for wine rather than a voice for truth. She had promised herself she would never let words get her into trouble again. She would be the silent polyglot, the woman who knew 7 ways to say disaster but didn't have the courage to whisper one. She thought she was safe in her silence. She was wrong. The shift in the room didn't happen with a shout. It happened with a sudden, heavy silence that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the gold-leafed vents. Imani was standing by the vintage sideboard, polishing a silver dessert spoon, when the double doors of the private dining suite swung open. Seo Junti didn't walk into a room so much as he reclaimed it. He was younger than the rumors suggested, but he carried a gravity that made the floorboards seem to dip beneath his polished Oxfords. His black suit was tailored with lethal precision, but it couldn't hide the ink that climbed his throat, dark, intricate patterns that disappeared beneath a crisp white collar. His hands, resting momentarily on the back of the leather chair at the head of the table, were mapped with tattoos that spoke of a history far more violent than the corporate spreadsheets laid out before him. He was the center man, the sun around which the rest of the room's dark planets orbited. Behind him trailed a small entourage, including a man Imani recognized immediately as Min-Yi Park. Park was the kind of man who wore a smile like a weapon, his eyes darting around the room, calculating the price of everything and the value of no one. He sat to Junti's right, opening a leather portfolio with practiced, sycophantic grace. Across from them sat the gray-haired businessman Imani had been serving all evening. They had been loud and boastful moments before, but as Junti sat, their spines straightened and their smiles turned brittle. The older man on the left reached for a gold-plated pen, his fingers trembling just enough for Imani to notice. "Shall we begin?" the older man asked, his voice cracking slightly. Junti didn't answer. He simply leaned back, his dark eyes hooded and unreadable, fixed on the contract in the center of the table. He looked like a predator watching a trap he already knew was there. Imani stepped forward, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She moved with her usual ghostly efficiency, uncorking the Bordeaux and leaning in to pour for the center man. As the dark red liquid swirled into his glass, she caught the scent of sandalwood and cold iron. Up close, Junti's presence was even more suffocating. He didn't look at her, but she felt his awareness, a sharp, cold intelligence that seemed to weigh her very soul. Min-Yi Park began to speak, his voice a smooth, rhythmic flow of Korean, translating the opening remarks of the Atlanta businessmen. To any other waitress in the building, it was just melodic noise. But to Imani, it was a siren blaring. She felt the first prickle of ice down her spine. Park wasn't just translating, he was editing. He was smoothing over the jagged edges of the contract's predatory clauses, turning threats into promises and theft into a partnership. Imani pulled back, the bottle heavy in her hand. She stood in the shadows of the corner, the invisible witness, watching the center man pick up the pen. The air in the room didn't just feel tense anymore. It felt like a fuse was burning, and she was the only one who could see the spark. The gold-plated pen hovered over the signature line, a sliver of light reflecting off its polished surface. Across the table, the gray-haired businessman leaned in, his smile widening into something that looked less like a gesture of friendship and more like a shark sensing blood in the water. "Mr. CEO," the older man said, his voice dripping with feigned sincerity, "this clause regarding the Midtown development is purely a formality. The standard safety net to ensure both parties are protected during the initial construction phase. It's a gesture of good faith." Imani stood perfectly still by the sideboard, a fresh linen cloth draped over her arm. She watched Minyi Park lean toward Junti's ear. Park's voice was a low, melodic hum, but to Imani's trained ears, every syllable was a discordant note. "He says the Midtown clause is a tribute to your father's legacy," Park translated in Korean, his tone hushed and respectful. "He says they have waived the standard oversight fees because they trust your name more than they trust the bank. It is a sign of ultimate submission to your authority." The breath hitched in Imani's throat. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a masterpiece of deception. The actual English text on page 12 didn't mention a legacy or a tribute. It was a 60-40 profit-sharing split hidden behind a complex maintenance and overhead calculation that would effectively drain Junti's liquid assets within 18 months. It was the same architecture of lies Julian had used, the same standard formality that had turned her own life into a pile of ash. She recognized the rhythm of the con, the way Park played on Junti's pride, using the nuances of honorifics to mask the cold, hard theft buried in the fine print. Park was betting on the fact that the man with the neck tattoos was too powerful to double-check the details, and too dangerous for anyone else in the room to dare correct the translation. Junti's finger tapped rhythmically against the mahogany table. Tap, tap, tap. He looked at the contract, then back at the older man. He was a king being led to a gilded chopping block, and he was being told the blade was a crown. Imani felt the phantom weight of her mother's hospital bills pressing against her chest. She saw the final notice flickering in her mind's eye. If she stayed silent, she stayed safe. She kept her job, her tips, and her invisibility. But as she watched Park's smug, sideways glance at the businessmen, a look of triumph shared between thieves, the nothing face she had perfected began to crack. She realized that the only thing worse than being a victim of a lie was being the one who stood by and let the lie become the truth. The language of betrayal was universal, and Imani Cross was the only one in the room who knew how to translate it into justice. The silence in the private suite was so brittle it felt as if a single heartbeat could shatter it. CEO Junti's fountain pen touched the paper, the nib spreading a tiny, dark blossom of ink onto the signature line. The gray-haired businessman let out a breath he had been holding for 20 minutes, his eyes already gleaming with the reflected gold of the overhead chandelier. "Wait." The word was small, but in the vacuum of that room, it sounded like a gunshot. Every head at the table snapped toward the shadows by the sideboard. Imani didn't realize she had spoken until the tray in her hand rattled. Her heart was a frantic bird battering against her ribs, but as she stepped into the light, the nothing face of the waitress fell away, replaced by the sharp, terrifying clarity of the woman she used to be. Minyi Park's face contorted into a mask of indignant fury. "What are you doing? Get out of here," he hissed in English, his voice cracking. He turned to Junti, switching to a frantic, apologetic Korean. "I am so sorry, sir. The help is, she's clearly unwell. I'll have the manager remove her immediately." Imani didn't look at Park. She kept her gaze locked on the center man. She ignored the trembling in her knees and spoke, the Korean syllables rolling off her tongue with a precision that silenced the room. "Don't sign that, Mr. Seo," she said, her voice steady and low. "Because if you do, you aren't signing a partnership. You're signing a death warrant for your Midtown holdings." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. Junti froze, his pen still pressed to the paper. He slowly lifted his head, his dark, hooded eyes narrowing as they searched Imani's face. It was the first time he had truly looked at her, and the weight of his stare was physical. "Go on," Junti commanded in his native tongue, his voice a gravelly rumble that sent a shiver down Imani's spine. "The translator is lying to you," Imani said, stepping closer to the table, ignoring Park's panicked attempt to grab her arm. "On page 12, clause 4, the section he told you was a tribute to your father. It's a 60-40 profit-sharing split favoring the Atlanta group. It isn't a sign of submission. It's a parasitic drain. They aren't waiving fees. They're hiding them in the German subtext on the third appendix." Minyi Park's face went from red to a ghostly, translucent white. He opened his mouth to protest, but the sound that came out was a pathetic wheeze. The older businessman on the left had gone completely still, the gold pen slipping from his nerveless fingers and clattering onto the mahogany table. Imani felt the rush of it, the power of the truth after 2 years of forced silence. She was no longer invisible. She was the only person in the room who mattered. She looked at Junti, seeing the calculation behind his eyes shift from confusion to a cold, predatory understanding. She had broken every rule of the Gilded Lily, and she knew with a terrifying certainty that her life as a waitress was over. But for the first time since the day Julian Sterling had ruined her, Imani Cross felt like she was finally standing on solid ground. The aftermath of the truth was a cold, violent blur. Gerald, the floor manager, was waiting for Imani by the kitchen swinging doors, his face a mottled shade of purple that matched his silk tie. He didn't wait for her to set down her tray. He grabbed her by the upper arm, his fingers digging into her skin through the thin fabric of her white blouse, and dragged her toward the service exit. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and rage. "That was the Sterling Cole Group, Imani. Those men pay for the very air you breathe in this building. You don't just interact with the private guests. You don't speak unless you're asked for more sparkling water." "They were stealing from him, Gerald," Imani said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears, sharper, steadier. "The translation was a fabrication. I don't care if they were stealing the moon." Gerald shoved a manila envelope into her hands, her final pay calculated with a cruel, instantaneous efficiency. "You're done. Don't go back for your coat. Don't speak to the staff. If I see your face within a block of the Lily again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Get out." The heavy steel door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the damp alleyway. The humid Atlanta night air hit her like a physical weight. Imani stood there for a moment, the envelope clutched to her chest, the reality of her situation sinking in. She had no job, no insurance, and in 48 hours, the hospital would be calling for the next installment of her mother's care. She had traded her survival for a stranger's bank account. She began to walk, her heels clicking rhythmically against the cracked pavement as she headed toward the bus stop 3 blocks away. But as she turned the corner onto the dimly lit side street, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. The silence of the city felt wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. A black sedan with tinted windows crawled along the curb behind her, its engine a low, predatory growl. Imani quickened her pace, her heart hammering against the pay envelope. From the shadows of a recessed storefront, 2 men stepped out. They weren't wearing the polished suits of the restaurant. They wore heavy tactical jackets and the blank, clinical expressions of men paid to make problems disappear. These were Nathan Cole's fixers, the safety net for a deal that had just been shredded. "Miss Cross," one of them said, his voice as cold as the steel door that had just locked her out. "Mr. Cole would like to discuss your understanding of confidentiality in a more private setting." Imani backed away, her eyes darting for an escape route, but the sedan had swung around, blocking the mouth of the alley. The invisible waitress was finally being seen, And as the men closed the gap, she realized that the truth didn't just set you free, it made you a target. The air in the alleyway turned arctic as the two fixers closed in, their shadows stretching long and jagged under the flicker of a dying street lamp. Imani's back hit the cold brick of the restaurant's exterior, the manila envelope of her final pay crinkling against her chest. She looked for a gap, a way out, but the black sedan had pinned her in, its headlights cutting through the dark like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. "Let's not make this difficult, Miss Cross," the larger man said, reaching for her shoulder. His hand was a thick, calloused weight that promised a very different kind of silence than the one she had practiced at the Gilded Lily. Before his fingers could graze her blouse, a blur of movement erupted from the darkness behind the sedan. There was no shout of warning, only the wet thud of a strike and the sharp, metallic click of a door being kicked open. One of Nathan Cole's fixers was suddenly airborne, his body slamming into the side of the sedan with a force that shattered the tinted glass. The second man went down a moment later, his arm twisted at an angle that made Imani's own joints ache in sympathy. Two men in charcoal suits, men she recognized from the periphery of Seo Jun-T's table, moved with a synchronized, terrifying efficiency. They didn't breathe hard, they didn't hesitate. They dismantled the threat as if they were clearing a table of dirty dishes. One of the guards stepped toward Imani. He was tall, his face a granite mask of professionalism. He didn't offer a hand to help her up, but he stood between her and the groaning men on the pavement, a human shield of incredible lethality. "Mr. Seo does not appreciate his interests being interfered with," the guard said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "And currently, Miss Cross, you are his most significant interest." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored card. It was unmarked. No name, no logo, only a single embossed telephone number and a series of coordinates in the bottom corner. He held it out to her, his eyes unblinking. "Be at this location tomorrow at 10. Do not be late. And do not worry about the hospital bills for your mother, Dorothy. They have been settled for the next 6 months." Imani stared at the card, the weight of it in her hand feeling heavier than the $1,200 bottle of Bordeaux she had poured hours ago. The guard didn't wait for a thank you. He stepped back into the shadows, and within seconds the black sedan was gone, leaving only the shattered glass and the silence of the Atlanta night. Imani stood alone in the alley, her heart finally slowing its frantic pace, realizing that she hadn't just escaped a trap. She had been claimed by a different kind of power altogether. The coordinates on the cream-colored card led Imani far from the glitz of Buckhead, deep into a pocket of the city where the streetlights were sparse and the air smelled of rain and charcoal. Han Wool was not a restaurant one could find on a map or a review site. It was an unmarked wooden door nestled between two industrial warehouses, guarded by nothing but a small, flickering stone lantern. When Imani stepped inside, the transition was jarring. The interior was a sanctuary of minimalist dark wood, the floor covered in soft tatami mats that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. There were no menus, no waiters, and no other patrons. In the center of the room, seated behind a low table, was Seo Jun-T. He had traded the sharp black suit for a deep charcoal robe that made him look less like a modern gangster and more like an ancient king. The tattoos on his neck seemed to pulse in the low amber light. He didn't look up as she approached. He was focused on the meticulous task of preparing tea, his movements slow and deliberate. "Sit," he said, the word a soft command. Imani knelt across from him, her spine straight despite the exhaustion clawing at her. She placed the unmarked card on the table between them. "My mother's bills," she began, her voice steady. "Why?" Jun-T finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing but her own defiant face. "Minyi Park was with me for 5 years, he said, his voice a low rumble. "I paid him enough to buy a dozen houses. I gave him my trust, which is worth more than any currency. And yet, for a handful of silver from a man like Nathan Cole, he chose to rewrite the truth." He poured a stream of pale green tea into a ceramic cup and pushed it toward her. "The world is full of people who can speak 7 languages, Miss Cross. But it is empty of people who will tell the truth when it costs them everything. You lost your job, your safety, and your peace of mind for a man you didn't even know. That is not a skill, that is a character. Imani felt the weight of his scrutiny. It wasn't the predatory gaze of the men in the alley. It was a search for a crack, a flaw, a price tag. I don't want a translator who tells me what I want to hear, Junti continued, leaning forward. I want a woman who sees the trap before the teeth snap shut. I want someone who cannot be bought, because I intend to make her the most powerful voice in my world. Imani looked at the tea, then back at the man who held the keys to her mother's survival. She realized then that this wasn't just a job offer. It was a partnership born in the fires of a shared disdain for lies. She reached for the cup, her fingers brushing against his. And for the first time in 2 years, the invisible waitress felt the true, heavy heat of her own power. The boardroom of the Midtown Development Group was a cathedral of glass and steel, overlooking an Atlanta skyline that finally looked like an opportunity rather than a cage. 3 weeks had passed since the night at the Gilded Lily, and the woman who sat to the right of Seo Junti was unrecognizable as the waitress who had once lived in the shadows. Imani wore a suit of sharp, midnight navy, her posture echoing the quiet authority of the man beside her. She wasn't just translating words, she was translating intent, her voice the bridge over which millions of dollars and the future of the city now flowed. The negotiation was a slaughter. Nathan Cole's replacements were desperate, their original predatory clauses replaced by terms Imani had helped Junti refine in the quiet hours at Han Wool. When the final signatures were dry, Junti didn't offer a celebratory drink or a handshake. He simply stood, the sheer gravity of his presence commanding the room to go still. "We are done here," he said in Korean, and for the first time, Imani didn't have to repeat it for the room to understand the finality of the statement. As the lawyers scrambled to gather their leather portfolios, Junti gestured for Imani to stay. The room emptied until it was just the two of them, the setting sun casting long, golden bars across the mahogany table. The silence between them had changed over the last 21 days. It was no longer the cautious quiet of strangers, but the heavy, expectant hum of two people who had seen each other's scars. Junti reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy piece of cream cardstock, the same quality as the one that had saved her life in the alley. He didn't say a word as he slid it across the table toward her. Imani picked it up. On the back, in Junti's sharp, disciplined handwriting, were 4 Korean words. She didn't need a dictionary to feel the heat rising in her chest as she read them. Nan niulul bogo isyo, I am seeing you. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of her work or her utility. It was an answer to the invisible girl who had spent years hiding her brilliance to survive. It was a promise that in his world she was no longer a ghost or a pair of hands. She was the one constant he trusted. Imani looked up, her eyes meeting his. The cold, predatory mask of the crime boss had softened, just enough for her to see the man who had been as lonely in his power as she had been in her poverty. She didn't thank him. Instead, she folded the card and tucked it into her pocket, right against her heartbeat. "The next meeting is at 6, she said, her voice a low, steady promise. Junti nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Then let's not be late." Imani walked out of the boardroom, her step lighter than it had been in years. Atlanta was still a city of secrets, but as she pressed her hand against the warmth of the card in her pocket, she knew that her story was no longer being written by others. She had found her voice, and for the first time, someone was truly listening.